We began dreaming about the Gospel Initiative at Denver Seminary in 2017 and began to talk about it with our board. We were able to receive funding from one of our trustees that will allow us to do this for at least 10 years. And then we just dived in. And we've talked about structural racism. We've talked about sexuality. Julie, you were presented here on gender identity as well. And the whole issue, the whole point is not just to have a conversation about these matters. The issue is not to take positions or sides necessarily. The point is, how can we be better informed believers in Jesus Christ as we interact with those around us for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of their thriving? That's really what this is about. Yes, the inbox gets full after these. We always have some folks who aren't particularly interested or desirous of Christians talking about these issues in ways that aren't necessarily what they agree with. But I just want all of you to know it's worth it, and we're not going to stop. We're going to keep diving into these tough issues. I've wanted to do something on gun violence for the last 5 years, so being able to have that conversation in ways that are truly, truly meaningful for the sake of the gospel is our goal here. So thank you, Patty, and thank you, Jason, for making this possible. And thank all of you for being here this afternoon. I'd like to, if I could, begin our time together tying together this whole question of gun violence, particularly school gun violence, and the effect of that reality in our culture on youth mental health. Are you interacting with kids around those topics? Are you seeing that as a part of the problem? And what are ways that then we can interact with folks in our schools who are fearful because of gun violence? Anybody want to dive into that one?
Probably my world. So yeah. It's interesting because when the School Counseling Mental Health Initiative started around 2018, there was a lot of focus on school shootings. There had been a series of, and then Colorado, unfortunately, has had its misproportionate share of school shootings. And there's ongoing focus, but what's interesting now is I think the suicide rate has taken a lot of attention away from that risk, and yet they're completely tied together. Good posture. And apparently, the microphone's trying to help me with my posture. So I think a part of what has happened is kids have become accustomed to the precautions that are being taken around school shootings. I had one kid tell me they loved they don't call them active shooter drills, but that's what it was. They loved active shooter drills because it was 20 minutes where they just got to sit real quiet. And they didn't totally grasp what was happening. Now that kid's older, they understand, and there's anxiety when those things happen. So I think some of it's a question of how the schools are handling it, and I think there's been some learning that's taken place, thankfully. The way that active shooter drills were carried out early on was terrifying and traumatizing for a lot of kids. I think most, but not all, but most schools, most districts have learned the lessons, and research has been done on what's necessary and what's helpful and what's unnecessary and what's harmful. So I think some level of anxiety has dropped for kiddos, but a sad reality is I think for a lot of them it's just kind of accepted as this is just normal. And if it was a kiddo growing up in the 60s, 1960s in the U.S., it would be similar to like assassinations. Yeah. It just became normal. Like it was just like weekly you would hear about new assassinations or riots or whatever it was. So I think it's become a part of their DNA. But I think what's happened is there's an overall ubiquitous anxiety that exists for youth in general. There's this sense of being at risk at all times. And I remember that after September 11th. I remember a lot of people, that was college, but I remember a lot of people, just this overall sense, like the loss of safety and security. I think that's probably more common now.
Other observations or thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things that is coming to mind for me is how a lot of times with anxiety, we talk about it being a perceived threat that we're responding to, not an actual threat, but something that you have perceived as threatening that would not be considered that. this presents a lot of challenges with youth when you're trying to address anxiety around shootings because they know it's a possibility. So that innocence of, no, that would never happen, or even cognitive disputation strategies you might use with anxiety, let's create a hierarchy and what percentage chance is it that would happen? Well, the pervasiveness of it speaks for itself with them. And the right to be afraid. And so I think that's one of the challenges I see for parents, because so many parents hold a lot more anxiety now than ever before around how likely and realistic it could be that something tragic could happen in a school environment. And it feels, much like you mentioned, just the familiarity with it has created a really interesting numbness in people. So they might not even want to talk about it in therapy. I find myself having to ask a lot. And I think that can translate into other settings, that teens might not be vocal about how distressing that is. But the way it's impacting their mental health is still there.
Well, if I can comment for a second, one of the things that I would observe in general, and there's been some interesting research on this in the last year or two, is the impact that unfiltered exposure to the news is having on kids. And so, the extent to which there's like a secondary trauma when kids are online and on these platforms, on TikTok, Instagram, other places, people are talking about that. Does it impact, is this impacting kids in terms of their level of anxiety to a greater degree than what we're aware? And I don't hear about that as much, but one of the things that I'll hear about from kids, for example, in terms of controversial issues, is climate change. And the extent of the anxiety around that. So I think that when there's one of these incidents in the news, and I know this impacted you guys very early on. In our small rural county east of Cleveland, we had a mass shooting at the high school in our county seat, and people were profoundly impacted by that. But the extent to which, when we were growing up, there was Walter Cronkite from 6:30 to 7, and that's what you heard. But literally for hours a day when these kids are on social media, that they're hearing about, school shootings, terrorism, climate, these other issues. And to what extent is that unfiltered conversation, their exposure to this, making things more difficult for them?
If I could add to that, we had an experience a few years back here. There was a woman who flew into Colorado with a perceived plan to have a shooting, so they locked down all the schools in the area and kids were kept at home. And subsequent to that, and the woman unfortunately killed herself before anything else occurred, but my daughter came home, and she was probably maybe first grade at the time, came home and said, Daddy, a kid told me that a woman shot herself with a shotgun. And I'm to a first grader, now I have to explain suicide, mental illness, this is why your schools were locked down. And it wasn't even because she was exposed at our home, but it's because somebody else, no judgment to that family, I don't know the circumstances, but a kiddo, came with this detailed information. So I think there is something to that, the lack of protection that we can have over the content that our kids are exposed to is a factor, even when it's not even directly to our kiddo in our home maybe, but it's something that's going to spread throughout the culture, the kids.
So what is the messaging of the church and of concerned adults in the lives of teens and children when we're in an environment with increased sense of anxiety, the potential of violence, the types of general societal concerns that we're experiencing? What messaging is supportive and helpful for youth and teens, or youth and children? How do we help them?
I'll jump in here. You always got to start with Mr. Rogers.
please do.
Yeah.
You've almost got a cardigan on. Go ahead.
That's right, that's right. After September 11th, they asked Mr. Rogers to come out of retirement and do a little public service announcement for kids who are scared. And he said, my mother always told me whenever something bad happened, look for the helpers. And that's, I think, a profound statement, is turning our kids' view, not just like pretending the terror or the bad thing isn't there, but saying like, what do you notice about the people who are helping? What do you notice about the people who aren't causing the harm? Like, it's a question of our focus of, in this moment, this is the thing that's front and center because it's so horrible. Yeah. But to turn and say, like, how can you see the people that are helping, or in what way that's appropriate for their age and their emotional readiness? How can you be in a place of promoting good and positive things? Again, being careful we don't put too much weight on our kiddos in a situation like that, but helping them to see, do you notice your teachers? Do you notice your helpers? Do you notice the people who are there to support? And that's a stabilizing thing for them to see, like, okay, there's structure around me that's good.
It's very helpful.
And I would add to that, how the parent responds is profoundly important, because like the parents' attitudes and approaches to this are going to have a lot to do with the extent to which the kid internalizes feeling safe. Because if the parents start acting as if they're not safe, the kid's going to feel unsafe.
Yeah, and there's such a balance there, because sometimes parents will go stoic with it, right? Because they don't want to dysregulate a child, but finding ways to be regulated and articulate emotions that would be common to feel, right? Like, yeah, sometimes it can feel really scary to step into public spaces, and not necessarily saying, I also feel terrified, but like that can be really scary, and that makes sense that you feel that way. Maybe you also feel really overwhelmed. Maybe you feel angry. Like, you might like to just go to school and be with your friends and eat lunch and do all those things and not have to worry about it. And with the anger in particular, I'm always thinking of how to express that emotion, since sometimes when we take it in and we turn it inward, it can implode in some of those mood concerns. And so I'm always talking, what are you going to do about that? Because there's so much powerlessness that everybody feels, I think, with gun violence and so many other things, the war in Ukraine and Gaza, all these things. And always, like, what's one thing this week that you want to do that could be really meaningful and connecting? I've had kids write letters to kids in other school districts who have undergone a shooting, or, you know, people who wanted to donate to a cause in Ukraine, or whatever it might be. But what's something you can do with this? And if they're young, rallying a community around that, I think, is a really meaningful way, because when we're grieving, community is a huge buffer against the negative effects of that. And rallying in that way is super meaningful.
Which points out then the epidemic of loneliness actually mitigates against the kinds of health that's possible when you have that sense of community and those around you. Let me ask a question here coming from the audience. Each of you has pointed to the effects of technology, social media, as a significant contributor to mental illness in your youth. Additionally, you've all acknowledged that it is an inevitable reality for our next generations. Could each of you give some practical advice, guidance on how to coach kids through the healthy use of technology and social media?
So we can go in line order here. This is something I said in our breakout. For some of you, this will be repetition, but I think one of the best things we can do, because this is so ubiquitous to their experience, they don't see it, and they aren't tracking it. What is affecting them? It's kind of like an undertow. If it's a gradual undertow, you might not realize you're being pulled someplace until you're already a farther distance than you realized. And I think for a lot of them, they don't feel the undertow because they've always been swimming in those waters. And so for us to help them have reference points, to be able to start to see what is the role of technology in your life, how does it affect you? Again, my daughter, poor girl, she doesn't have a phone but her friends will text my phone, which is, let me tell you, having a tween daughter's friends texting you is amazing. But they will text me, and when the ding goes off, she'll be like, as a starter, it's like, oh, take a breath. Just take a breath before I'll hand her the phone to respond. Because helping her see, like, you're being trained. You are being affected by this technology, it's no judgment on her or any of these kids. It's like they don't see it. They don't know. We don't. As adults don't see it often. So I think that's probably the first step, is helping them to see, like, what do you notice when your friends are on their phones and you're talking to them? What do you notice when you guys are all hanging out after school? What do you notice for yourself when you've been on the phone for a while, or you've been looking at TikTok or whatever it is, if that's what they have access to? Like, what is it you notice? What do you feel? Without judgment, without like trying to shame them about it, just saying, like, what do you notice about it? What do you see in your friends? What's the kind of tone? What's the kind of messaging? How does that fit with what you think our family's values are, what your values are? So I think it's that kind of meta awareness is the big picture goal.
So let me throw out a couple of things. Usually because, being a child psychiatrist, a lot of kids are kind of in a bad way by the time I get to see them. And it's interesting how many kids I see in my practice who use the computer and gaming and social media as their primary coping mechanism for dealing with their emotional stuff. Kids who are anxious in particular use it as a way of distracting themselves from their anxious thoughts, so that it can be healthy for many of them, and a lot of them will actually regress, like when parents try to take it all away as like a punishment or reaction. So that it becomes a problem, like when your kid doesn't have other coping mechanisms and can't stop when they need to. And so that would be something as a parent that I would take as a sign that maybe you need to have, a counselor, somebody involved to help teach them some of the skills, to be able to, to manage their emotions in other ways. And one quick comment, kind of related to this, that I'll make here, because it's something that I see with a lot of folks in ministry, is that there are a lot of people in ministry who start commenting on, taking pictures of, and sharing things about their kids on social media that I'm not sure is necessarily healthy, or that they have, that they have a right to do. And that, because we tell kids, like, once it's up there, it's forever. And so, again, the emphasis today that, parents have to model, for their kids the behavior and the change that we want to see. What are we communicating to folks when people who are working in churches and serving in ministry are looking at how many likes and reshares they get on Instagram when they're, posting pictures of their children or bragging about their exploits online?
Yes, one of the other things that's coming to mind is, and it's no surprise, it's similar to what we've talked about already, but it's a bit of a paradoxical intervention, right? If a teen thinks you're going to come in and hammer them for their social media use and try to make them realize how bad it is for them, they're going to go on the offensive, and they're going to have all the reasons why it's so great for them. But the first thing I always do if parents want me to talk about social media use, which every parent does with their teen, is everybody gives social media a real bad rap. Have you noticed that? It's like the thing everybody talks about. But I bet they're missing some of the things it really does that nothing else does for you. And then that helps me know how much they use it as their number one coping skill. Because most of them do. I mean, I have teens that will have panic attacks if their parent takes their phone away for 5 minutes. And that's a red flag. And it's not uncommon. Most parents don't find it out because they are so tired of the battle that they just give up. Most parents I ask, what restrictions do you have in place? Say, we don't have any. Because we don't even know where to begin on that. So number one is helping that teen feel freedom to articulate, right? All the ways it's really helpful. And if you're a parent, this is what we do in therapy, right? Anything we're asking somebody to give up, we have to honor its place first. And it's the most inefficient thing in the world. But tell me all the things I don't get as a parent or as a therapist as to why that's so essential in your life right now. And they'll really get animated and they'll start talking. And then I'll just say, like anything in life, there's probably ways it pushes you around. Unless you're superhuman, there's probably moments where social media is not as helpful for you. Does anything come to mind? And then I'll share things for me. Here's the ways it pushes me around, right? And suddenly they're thinking critically, and I love what you said about the awareness. Then they're starting to notice, and I've even seen parents do a test, like you have 2 hours of uninterrupted social media time. I want you to stay on TikTok for 2 hours straight, and then report back how you feel. And then tomorrow we're gonna try something else in that 2-hour block. Let's just see. The last thing I'll say is this, I've done a challenge with some team clients, like, I want you to, for 1 hour this week, hide the phone or give it to your parent and do anything else with that time. And let's just see what your mental health is like at the end of that week. And they don't realize until it's gone how hard it is to not have it. And so the first week they do it, they're miserable that hour, and they're distracted, and they're anxious. And the second week, and third week, they're doing paint by number, or they're crocheting, or it's like, okay. So those are the things that come to mind for me. How do we expand and create pockets for them to actually notice the difference?
I got one more thing based off that. I think, and something connected to what you said too, is that the idea of teaching our kids how to diversify their funds. Like finances, we know how you diversify your funds, right? But it's the idea of the coping skill doesn't have to be good or bad. It's a question of what do you do if you can't do that one? Because if we take technology out, we pick your, or my coping skill of choice, and whatever it is, might be a fine thing, might be crocheting, right? But what if you can't crochet, right? What are you gonna do if you can't crochet? What if you can't read your Bible? What if you can always pray, but what if you can't do the thing, like I love backpacking. I have a family, like I can only do that every so often. So what is it that I have in my toolbox in helping kids understand the idea of having a repertoire that you can pull out lots of different things at any given moment, and then they start to notice that all those things do similar things for me. Like I feel good when I do all those things, and some of them do different things. I think that's a key, like helping them understand that, because I think that's a good adulting life skill, is how do you cope in a multitude of ways as opposed to a way.
Yeah, really helpful. One of the questions here is asking about perhaps a different understanding and different conversation about teens and children, our kids today, and that is, what's admirable about this generation, or about the generation of folks, say, between the age of 10 and 20 now, and what in those traits that are admirable, what gives us hope as we think about them moving into adulthood and for the rest of their lives and their contributions to our society? What's admirable and what gives us hope?
I think that a lot of the younger people I see, like when I compare this to a generation ago, are remarkably empathic. And so that, that ability to be able to sort of come alongside the desire to comfort, and the desire to support others, could ultimately be a really powerful tool, for our kids in ministry. And that it may be important, like the whole ministry of presence thing, their ability to be with their peers without necessarily having to ram doctrine down their throat, but just being present, I think can be a really profound witness.
I think it's a profoundly creative group of people. And I was just sitting here trying to think of how much you credit that to having access to so many tools of creativity, but they have at their hands digital artwork and the things that they can create. And my kids just showed me a video of somebody doing Gangnam Style to learning timelines in middle school. And it was a middle school project. Some kid just put together a video of him singing timeline song to Gangnam Style. The level of creativity and the endless ideas that they have is remarkable. And I think it's easy to dismiss it as often just towards frivolous, silly stuff. But I think they are very nimble. They're quick thinkers, and they struggle maybe to problem solve in certain areas. But I think when it comes to figuring out how they want to create something that they want to create, it's astounding what they can come up with. Yeah.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind for me. The first is a real passion for justice. I even think back to being a teen, and it's like, I don't know that I was quite as passionate as they are. I mean, you could just feel it. And I love that. I mean, it's helping them channel that and steer that in directions that are life-giving for them and for society, and helping remove barriers to constructive ways to do that. But that is such a gift to the world and to the church. The other thing that I think of, though, is the lack of stigma around mental health care. You know, if I'm going, sometimes teens will invite me to like a school performance or something. Let's say they were working on performance anxiety, and so they want me to come see their band concert. And you always ask, you know, do you want me to just come and go? Do you want me? Oh my gosh, all my friends know about you. You better not leave before I can at least point you out to them. That's my therapist. And with most of the adults I meet with, that is not the same thing. And so for all the challenges, at least there's an access point to treatment. It's not perfect, and there's a lot of flaws in our treatment. We do not have it figured out on how to address these things holistically. But for people to be able to get in the door, and then they get in the door and their parent comes in and says, I want a referral because I've seen in a year my child who was suicidal is not experiencing that anymore, and I've been suicidal and I haven't told anybody, right? And that's the ripple effect. That gives me hope. Because if they can get the treatment they deserve, the parents sometimes get curious. I wonder what I could do and be for my family. And that's a pretty profound impact on the family and then on the broader culture in our church.
Boy, that's excellent. Thank you all very much. That is hope-giving, right? Let's talk about what you mentioned, regulation, as did you call it a keystone of mental health? Mm-hmm. What are some practical examples of how to help folks achieve that kind of regulation? What are some things we can do, certainly in a therapy setting, but in our family lives and in our interactions to help folks achieve that regulation that you talked about?
I think often, I think it's safe to say the number one enemy of regulation is a lack of awareness of kind of currently what's happening. Because often we run, it's on autopilot around certain things and don't realize how stressed we are or how tired we are or the fact that we've needed to go to the bathroom for like an hour and a half. But we're just moving so fast that it's not until we finally stop. That last one works for kids all the time, where they don't realize they have to go to the bathroom. They're doing the potty dance. You ask them, and they're like, oh, and like they go. So I think attunement is a key thing of what am I even feeling, or what am I even experiencing, or like what's happening around me. I think the more we can model that, for starters, to just stop and say like, man, I'm feeling kind of stressed. I think I needed to stop for a minute. And let our kids see that, I think is pretty profound. Or like kind of referencing like when you're feeling mad or feeling sad. There's a famous story with my kids when they were little that Daddy put himself in timeout. Because it's just like, I was at the edge and I was just like, Daddy needs a timeout. So I go around the corner and just like stand there for a minute. And you thought like, they're just like, what just happened? They still tell the story to this day. And so I think there's something in that for them to see like an adult having to regulate, like that you don't just constantly have it together, like that you need to like do something to slow down or sometimes speed up. Like, man, I need to get moving. I'm just like feeling super sluggish or whatever. So I think that's a part of it. And then I think it's back to the diversifying our funds of when we realize what we're feeling, having a set of things that we can do that we know, like when I feel sad, this helps. It doesn't make it all go away, but I know I can talk to somebody, or I know I can draw, or I know I can go play outside for a little bit, or like whatever to like kind of change towards a state that they want to be in, that there are options, I think would be a part of it. Yeah.
Very helpful.
I think one of the things for me is the trial and error piece of that. I think a lot of times because of the instantaneous nature of life today, I get a lot with teens of like, yeah, I tried that and it didn't work. And maybe you've felt that too in therapy or in life. You try, even prayer, it didn't work. And I think we have to expect regulation to be less efficient than any of the other things we go to because they're more efficient, right? Being on the phone is way more efficient. Taking a medication is more efficient. And again, there's no shame in that. It's just being realistic about what you're going to expect as you start to try to regulate. And that's both for you and also for the people you're trying to help regulate. So teens, especially, it takes time. It's a skill. And trying to buffer your own expectations, because it can feel really defeating. And maybe you sit with the teen and they're crying and you say, okay, let's slow our bodies down. And they get louder. And then you think, I'm never going to say that again. Well, no, you're going to say that again. You just might have to say it more calmly and more slowly and a few more times. And building their expectations for the fact that none of this is going to be quick. And it is going to be sustainable. And it takes time and it takes skills and it takes trial and error of different things that might surprise you that you didn't think you would like or value.
Yeah.
So a couple of things on that. It's interesting, like people, sort of pick and choose what elements of biblical anthropology they choose to embrace. And, when you think back to the Old Testament, there was the importance of the Sabbath and that there was a rhythm to life and a time to rest. And one of the things that I see a lot with the kids that I see is that when they are mentally and physically and emotionally exhausted, their capacity to be able to self-regulate is depleted. So that in a lot of ways, we ask kids to take on too much, to do too much. I see a lot of kids from highly competitive private schools where they're involved in sports till 7 or 7:30 every night, and then they got 3 to 4 hours worth of homework to do. And it's not healthy. And so one of the things that I think that's really important for us to think about is, we talked about this before, the more stuff you have to process, the less cognitive capacity you have to apply to the things that are most important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to add one thing there because it relates to suicidality, which is something that is hard to talk about and important to talk about. It seems to me to be the case that the suicidality, the part of people that's suicidal, is the part that looks around and says, this really is as bad as it feels, and I want to get out of this. And I help teens put words to that because sometimes they don't realize that it's really not, I want to be gone and dead. It's, I don't want to feel this way anymore. And it feels like the trump card that works. It gets everybody's attention. Finally, they get how bad it is. And I wonder about us catching on sooner, that it doesn't take that moment for us to be aware that, wow, they're more irritable, they're more tired, they've got bags under their eyes, they're, lost their patience with their sibling, their grades are slipping a little bit. And because I can see it in parents, as soon as that gets said, it's like, well, you don't have to do that class anymore. You don't have to do all those extra activities, but it's always striking to me that it takes that moment. And so how do we catch sooner the dysregulation that pushes people to the end of themselves? In the suicidality that can come from that.
And try to understand what's driving us to have that
Yes.
sense we must be engaged at this level and all the different things that we are engaged, right? Why?
Yeah.
What's causing us to want to do that? I'm not asking you, I'm just thinking out loud with you. Let me ask this question someone submitted. Can you give some concrete examples of boundaried empathy? How does one practically incorporate boundaries while trying to support youth struggling with mental health?
I think I'm the one that dropped that
Mental
term.
illness.
So I'll go back to the grandfather of counseling, Carl Rogers, who talked about empathy, and this is a paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote, but empathy is experiencing someone's emotions as if it was your own without ever losing the as if. And I think a difficulty is when there's a kid that you love or that you care for or that you're responsible for, you feel what they're feeling, but pretty soon you can become subsumed by it to where it feels like if they're not okay, I'm not okay. And a quote out of scripture that I'm kind of just yanking out of context, but it kind of works, is you will always have the poor, you won't always have me, or they'll always have the poor, you won't always have me. And is that idea of Jesus even recognized the limits of what can be done in a given moment or in a given context? That he didn't heal everybody that needed healing. He didn't engage with everybody when he was here because he had a greater goal. He had a longer game that he was playing. He felt compassion for the crowds, but he didn't engage every single need that was in that physical presence. And so I think for a lot of us as adults is recognizing when our emotions, we are feeling a level of angst and a level of anxiety ourselves towards helping that isn't really about the kiddo. It's not empathy. So boundaried empathy is when are you aware of what the kiddo's feeling and taking that time to calmly be present to be able to notice enough to feel what they're feeling so that you can help guide or support in some way. But if you find that after you go home for the day, you're still carrying that same level, and then over time it's just compounding. I think that's a recognition that maybe this is something where you're taking responsibility for whether or not that kid is going to be okay. And something I've struggled with in my life is a counselor and researcher and all the things is I really want to be in control of the outcomes. I really want to be able to make sure a good thing happens at the end. And my kids are going to be okay. That this client is going to be okay. And ad nauseum, God has reinforced in me that your job is to be present in the moment, be open to what I'm asking you to do, but you aren't responsible for the outcomes. Because again, majority of the clients I've seen in my career, I have no idea if they're okay. Probably 99.9% of them, I have no idea if they're okay. And I never will this side of heaven.
Yeah.
So I think there's something in that's the boundaries of knowing your own limitations and trusting God with the outcomes.
Yeah, I've never thought about what you just said, that 99.9% of your clients, you have no idea if they're still okay. Mm-hmm. Is that common throughout the mental health care professional world? That would be hard. How do you deal with that? Can I help you regulate around that?
That's right. Well, back when I was 11, no. I definitely.
Yeah, I wrestle with that a lot. I'm an empath, which won't surprise people who've heard me speak. And I remember many people in my life expressed to me concern, oh, you're going to be a therapist. How are you going to do it? And the number one question I get now is, how do you not take your work home? And I always say I don't know how to not take my work home because my work isn't paperwork, it's people. And people impact me. And in any work that we do, I think sometimes we can feel shame about that, like we're doing something wrong if people impact us. But it's not a badge of honor to be crushed by the weight of reality either. And sometimes we get kind of like, I only know I'm doing good work if I'm crushed when I leave. And what I would say is that the way to do effective work sustainably is that I know what to do when I do feel crushed by the weight of it. And I know how more days than not to transition into other things. And an image I gave them in my breakout that was given to me is the image of being in your own chair. Like, how do I stay in my chair with people? Because I can get out of it, out of powerlessness and hopelessness and fear for their safety. And then I'm out there acting, doing all these things that I have no business doing. So I need to stay where I'm called to be, which is across from you in my chair. And I carry you with me, you impact me. And the best way to show up for you is to be where my feet are. And that means when I leave, I'm there and not here. And I do a lot of cognitive work around that when I get in my car to go home. Like, what is my rhythm that's going to totally shift me out of this frame of reference, where I'm taking that hat off and I'm carrying people with me because I care about them. I haven't figured out how to not do that.
So I guess one response to that would be that I know that they're going to be okay because I've been doing this for 38 years and they've been okay. So some of it is just experience. I'm just young enough. I had a colleague work with me for 30 years who's 2.5 years older than me. And one of the requirements of training in psychiatry at the time was that you had to have your own therapy. And so I just missed that by like a year, but he went through it. And so, when you were talking about boundaries, I think that the difference is when is it about me as opposed to being about them and recognizing that. And then, some of this I think has to do with, how we proactively sort of define our role with kids and their families. So, part of how I explain what I do as a child psychiatrist is that my most unique contribution is to figure out why, from a biopsychosocial standpoint, you're having these struggles, because it's the understanding the why that leads to the what. And then, so if I can take the time, to understand that, when I start pointing them to the what, a lot of times the what doesn't specifically involve me. It's like, how can the school be supportive? What specific types of tools or skills or strategies can a good counselor or a therapist give you? How can we impact the environment? And then maybe for me in a situation where they need something medical, that's something that I go ahead and provide. But it's acknowledging that, like, I don't, at the end of the day, I don't have control over what these kids do. One of the things I thought that was really wonderful about the way that both of you guys presented stuff today is that, in my work with parents, it's difficult for them to go through sort of the transition when they can no longer put their kids in timeout and like drop them in a chair. And that you don't have, free will sucks. I have some questions to ask the Lord, someday about that. But there's a certain point in time with kids that you don't have control, that you have influence. And the influence that you have is based upon relationship. So that preserving that and cultivating that is something that is very central, and I think is something that I really was, impressed at the extent to which both of you sort of reinforced that in your presentations.
Yeah.
I have one spiritual practical thing that I don't remember how this started for me, but whenever I'd finish, typically when I would terminate with a client, I'd finish working with them. As I was walking out the door, as soon as I'd shut the door after they left, I would pray, Lord bless and keep them and make your face to shine on them. It was like that quick little benediction to our work with them. And I think it was out of that tension, that recognition of like, I have no idea what's happening now.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't always like, yay, everything's good.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like they ran out of coverage for insurance or something else changed, they moved. And so for me, there was something about that of like a spiritual handoff, but it was not so much of a handoff as a recognition that that's always been the case. I haven't ever been the one in control of where this kiddo is going. So I'm just acknowledging that now as the physical reality hits me that they're not going to be here.
Yeah, that's very helpful. All right, let's talk about something easy. A lot of the conversation around gender-affirming care, particularly in youth and children, was built, or not built, but certainly referenced mental health and possibility of suicide, like that statement that comes up, would you rather have a dead son or a living trans daughter, right? And that idea, or that, not that idea, that reality that there is a lot of tension, a lot of dysregulation perhaps, a lot of disconnection with gender dysphoria led to then perhaps, or contributed to, more openness to gender-affirming care. Now we're seeing a bit of a backlash toward gender-affirming care and its necessity. Help us navigate this world this reality of how can we as the church think about gender dysphoria, and then gender affirming care. Let's dive into that, okay? Might as well. That's what the Gospel Initiative is all about. Let's talk about the hard stuff. So let's just start with let's start with the question of gender. What is a responsible, theologically, biblically informed, and evidence-based view of gender? How do we define it, and how do we help our kids understand what is gender?
I can remember one lecture from my time as a psychiatry resident at Cleveland Clinic in the late 1980s. And it involved, there was someone who came in and they were doing a grand rounds on, kids who were born with ambiguous genitalia. And I even remember where I was sitting in a lecture hall, and one of the things that the guy said was that that whatever you do, the last thing you want to do is to confuse kids about their gender. And that, because one of the things that, that's related to this, and we talk about identity, that having a stable identity is so central to, to well-being and positive mental health. That when people in the church look at this and need to understand this, that we have to take a look at the kids who are wrestling with this as profoundly vulnerable. From a mental health standpoint, the outcomes for kids, like the T of the LGBTQ, are exponentially worse than they are for the kids who are LGBT. We know statistically, and this is stuff from adults, that adults who are, who identify as transgender have 6 times the rate of bipolar disorder than in the general population, 5 times the rate of ADHD, 5 times the rate of clinical depression, 28 times the rate of schizophrenia compared to the general population. So that these are people who, oftentimes are struggling with very significant mental illness. And, even within sort of this pool of kids who struggle with this is about as bad as it gets from a vulnerability standpoint. Now, at the same time, we as the church have a responsibility to make sure that kids who are vulnerable are not being exploited. So that when I look at this in the context of disability ministry, and when you look at the research and the data that came out of the UK, where every kid in the country who was wrestling with gender dysphoria and went for treatment went to one clinic in suburban London, and 35% of the kids that were treated in that clinic had a diagnosis of moderate to severe autism, which at the time was 17 times the rate of autism in the general population, in the UK. You start wondering, well, are they preying upon vulnerable kids? Have they taken the time to do the thoughtful things that they needed to do, from an evaluation standpoint to sort of tease all of that out? And so, we as a church do have a responsibility to stand up for the vulnerable. We also have a responsibility to stand up for truth. And one of the issues that has come up, talking to other people sort of in children's ministry. I was talking to a guy who had been involved with the Wesleyan denomination, supporting their children and student ministry people. He told me that this is the second most common request that they had for assistance from churches, specifically around this. And I think that, again, I think that the struggle we all get into is, sort of as Christians, is to sort of balance, grace and truth. And I could tell you personally, people ask, well, how do you handle this? I will call a kid by whatever name their parent wants me to call them, because, historically, in our culture and traditionally, according to Scripture, that is something that's a privilege and a responsibility of the parent. But it's also my responsibility as a Christian, not to lie. And so that I will not use pronouns that are divergent from what that child's, biological sex is. And one of my biggest concerns about this is that, being in ministry for 20 years, that part of why we're in the situation we're in with the church when it comes to mental health is that, if you go back 2 generations with, all of the moral relativism, situational ethics, the focus on self as opposed to the focus on others, folks in our evangelical tradition, sort of rejected that, but in rejecting that, they kind of rejected the people, oftentimes who had these struggles, who were being served by the folks who, the folks who were sort of the experts in terms of mental health and mental health treatment. We've made a lot of progress. I worry that we're going to go backwards now because one of the reasons I feel embarrassed and ashamed by my profession is that, as somebody who teaches evidence-based medicine at med school, that there seems to be a political agenda that has hijacked our profession, that has left them unable to acknowledge or recognize sort of research that suggests that a lot of this stuff isn't helpful. And so, so I think that it's important for us as a church that when we have families who are wrestling with this, and if they're going to the gender medicine clinic, we can't reject the family on the basis of them doing what they think is in the best interest of their child after taking them to licensed professionals. But at the same time, again, I don't think that we can abandon our advocacy for the vulnerable when it seems that kids with the most severe mental health issues are the ones who seem to be most likely to end up in these clinics. But at the same time, we're the only Bible that a lot of them see. And so if we reject these, if we reject them and are unwilling to, to be in some sort of relationship with them, to come alongside them, it wouldn't, it's no surprise to me that, if we're the only Bible that we see and if we're not willing to open ourselves up in front of them, that they would not come to know Christ as a result.
I think do we have time for?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. No, you're okay. I just
We're
want to
not saved by the clock.
So, as a therapist, it's something that I've struggled with, and I can't claim I theologically have landed the plane on all of these questions by any stretch. But a piece that I feel pretty confident in now is that when, as a therapist, somebody comes into the room, my role is to help them with their developmental process. So that could be related to their emotional developmental process, their social developmental process. It could be around identity, whether or not that's their general, an adolescent just trying to figure out who they are in the world. Could be an adult who's trying to figure out their career, like they're having a shift in career identity and where they go from there, post-divorce, any number of reasons. My goal is to help them developmentally to have the healthiest possible trajectory to go where they're going to go. Because again, I don't get to give the conclusions or even see the conclusions often. And when it comes to the questions of sexuality or gender, it's a mental exercise and it's not foolproof, but for me it was like, okay, when a person walks in the room and they say, this is what I want to work on, if I take that issue and I unplug it and I insert any other issue that somebody could come to me with that would be similarly around identity or development, would I approach it the same way that I'm approaching this right now? And if the answer is I'm approaching it differently, I need to have a pretty good reason as to why I would be approaching it differently. And so for me, it's to look at what are the barriers to this person having a cognitively healthy developmental process that they think through things in a healthy way, emotionally in a certain way, removing some of like the shame or damage or mistruths that maybe are guiding the thought process, helping them to understand how to explore what they think and feel about things in a way that is truth-based and accurate, but is not me asserting a conclusion because I don't get to have the privilege of determining their outcomes. So for me, having worked with a decent number of kiddos that are questioning gender over time, what I found is that when I take the time to sit down and try to understand their process and try to help them separate out external voices and instead ask the questions about what they really think and feel and why, where that's coming from, there'll be a good chunk of them that it's a phase that they go through, an identity kind of exploration thing, and then they shift and they move towards a different place. Some of them land in a place where they feel like this is truly who they are. And again, my theological conclusions don't change. Although again, like I said, I don't know that I have all of the plane landed on those things. But when it comes to my role in the room with that human, my role is to help them to think, feel, and understand things clearly in a way that whatever they choose, free will sucks sometimes, that whatever they choose, that it is done at least in an area where they've gone through a healthy process to come to that conclusion, whether or not I agree with the outcome that they come to.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be
Lots
said.
of thoughts. 2 books, right?
Yeah, I've written a bit on this. It's I'm sitting here trying to think like what is one thing I could offer that is concrete in this moment. I think it's no secret that it is so challenging to navigate this space around trans affirmative care. I'm really struck by what you shared about what many parents hear, which is that, you know, would you rather have a dead son or an alive daughter? And I think I'm just hit by the weight of that moment for parents. And I think if I'm in this room listening to this and this isn't my child's story or my story, there are certainly people in your community, families who are deeply wrestling with this. And just like you're hearing all the noise about what the best path is, so are they. And I would just recommend to you as somebody who's walked with these families that they really don't need one more person to send them books or articles on all sides. And I say that respectfully because I think we do that because we're trying to help. And we feel powerless and we're trying to learn. But what they really need are people who can hold space for just how challenging it is to hear those kinds of things from people and not know what to do, but know your child is suffering. So again, putting the political kind of on the shelf, that is important. God bless you if you're called into that space. When you're sitting with people, even the noise about the debate of trans affirmative care, it's like, okay, can I call local therapists for you to just help connect you to a couple of scheduling options? Like, those are the practical things these families need. How can I be praying for you all as you step into that? What are the questions that you're weighing as a family, and not assuming they're weighing the questions that you've heard about on news and media that people weigh. Historically, most people who identified as transgender and had dysphoria did not pursue medical interventions. So most people don't talk about that, but that has been the case. Most people have not done those things. Most people are just trying to survive one day at a time. And we can help people with that. And be honest about the things you don't know, because we do a lot of harm when we try to offer things out of fear of not knowing instead of being honest about what we know and don't know. And there's a lot, as a person who specializes in this, that I don't know. There's a lot the research can't tell us, and parents are trying to make decisions every single day for how to show up for their families, and it is challenging as all get out, especially today.
Well, your friendly neighborhood evidence-based medicine professor just wants to tell you that there's zero evidence to support if you don't do this, you're going to have a dead kid. But one of the things I think that both of these guys, manifested today is that, I have parents ask me all the time, like, how do you get people, how do you get kids to do stuff or to buy into treatment? And the part of what both of them, I think, address is that they take the time to understand what's going on.
Yes.
And that when kids and families feel understood, getting them to buy into what you're recommending is far easier. And that the reality with the system that we find ourselves in terms of like mental health care, is that a lot of these clinics are set up, as assembly lines. I'm not sure that like people feel like folks are taking the time to understand before they're wanting to rush into a particular treatment, or come to a particular conclusion. But one of the things that we can really do that's truly a blessing for our families is to give them, to give them a place and to give them relationships in which they can feel accepted and understood.
Super helpful. And if you're interested, on our website, denverseminary.edu, you can access a document that we call Statement on Human Sexuality and Gender. It was crafted by theologians, biblical scholars, and counselors, the main areas of instruction we have here at the seminary. I think it's proven to be helpful for families as well as for churches who are attempting to try to create some sense of how to integrate scriptural understanding, theological understandings, and clinical mental health or counseling understandings in relationship to these questions of sexuality and gender. Are we done, Jason, or do we have time for one more? One more, okay, good. There's a question here about adulting. There's a lot of conversation about folks who go through their teen years into young adulthood, post-college, yet still have difficulty finding some sense of direction or purpose, or even really being able to adult, whatever that means, sustain themselves. Can we see patterns, or do we see patterns of mental health challenges in children and youth that then do extend into early adulthood and create perhaps delayed development into some of the behaviors associated with adulting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many cases, that's where we first see a lot of the deeper struggles is in late adolescence, early adulthood is where some of the more profound impact hits of some of the, again, like my reference before to half-baked cakes, right? Like cake is starting to solidify at that point, and we start to see where maybe things haven't gone quite as ideal or as planned. So I think the outcomes that we see in young adulthood and even into kind of midlife, some of those, the lack of the foundational elements that support health, or a lack of those rhythms that would maintain or promote health, tend to fall apart once there isn't external structure guiding those things. And so people go off to college, and a lot of eating disorders show up then, and mood disorders. And there's biological reasons for some of those things too, but a good chunk of it is when there's a lack of external structure, the internal structure is what's going to hold something or somebody's kind of patterns together. And if they don't have that, then they tend to move out of rhythm. And so I think, yeah, the more we can do, the earlier we can do it for folks, sets people up for success. That doesn't mean there isn't hope for everybody. There is, but like all things, it's harder the older we get to shift those patterns and create new rhythms. And so to teach them while they're young is ideal, but I think for those in young adult ministries of whatever way, shape, or form, it's absolutely essential that we're having these conversations because it may be the first time they've ever had to think it through or had the chance to think it through on their own. So it's a big identity process as they shape how they want to live. Sure. Yeah.
I think parents, oftentimes because they struggle, like, seeing their child hurting, rescue them from too much stuff. And we're not giving kids the opportunities, while they're in like the structure of having a supportive family, of having to sometimes work through difficult things where they then, develop the resilience and develop the recognition that I can get through this and be okay. And as a result, I think that we have a lot of folks in our current generation, who become very uncomfortable when they get out into the adult world, and have to deal with, meeting the expectations of an employer, running or tolerating the discomfort when it comes to, something like dating. And so that, as parents, and as a Christian community, I think a great metaphor for this is like when we took all the jungle gyms off the playgrounds, because we didn't want kids to get hurt. We have to allow them to kind of get hurt a little bit sometimes and to experience a little bit about what that's like, while they are in, a structured environment in our families and their schools, so that they have the immunity in a sense, to be able to tolerate that once you take the family and once you take some of the other things, the structure away as you describe it.
I think sometimes people expect once they hit adulthood, they'll kind of grow out of some of the challenges they're facing. Like now I'm supposed to have arrived. And this is a vulnerability challenge, I think, in older adults. How do we be honest about the ways we haven't arrived? Because, as was already mentioned, right, a lot of mental health concerns actually start to develop or show their head more profoundly in college and emerging adulthood. And so how do we help anticipate challenges? And, there's entire forms of therapy rooted in the idea that we cannot escape suffering and pain. And that's not actually the goal. So the goal is not the absence of challenges in the areas we're talking about today. That's right. It's the robustness of a life around and within that. And it goes very far to believe somebody's capable of that in the midst of challenges in the ways we've been describing today. The wisdom that comes out of actually weathering real life on life's terms and even enduring the mental health challenges that come up for people. I mean, some of the wisest people I meet are the people I sit with in my office. And they're 18 and 20 and 24 and 60, so I think continuing to remember that as we grow older, we get wisdom from whatever we've survived, including mental health challenges that persist over time in many cases. You just become an expert on your own experience of it, hopefully. It doesn't necessarily go away. And I think offering that to people, that belief that maturation doesn't mean the absence of mental health disorders even. It just means how do I weather the storms of life with more effectiveness and know how to resource support of other people.
Yeah, and full disclosure, my wife and I took another step toward adulting when last year we got our own Netflix account and stopped signing in through our youngest son's account. So we're almost there.
Congratulations.
Just in time for retirement.
Yeah, this is good.
Well, thank you all very much for being a part of this event. Let's thank our panelists, if we could. Yeah. And as Patty mentioned, we have a couple of other significant events coming up later this month and then in April. And be sure to check out our website to do that. I'd like to pray for us as we finish. And so, Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of the presence of your Spirit in our midst and the wisdom from above that is ours as we depend upon him and as we hear the Spirit speak through our brothers and sisters. We pray that you would give us, Heavenly Father, through the work of your Spirit, deep compassion, deep empathy, particularly for those who are growing as children and as teens and young adults. The empathy that you demonstrated, Heavenly Father, in sending your Son on our behalf, we pray would be ours in full measure. Thank you for the gift of Scripture and truth, for the vision of the fullness of life that is ours as we walk with you. We thank you for all of this in the name of the one who modeled what it means to truly love, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.